I've been talking for years about the reality that Americans, in some general sense, like this idea of buy American stuff. But Americans are not really willing to pay for American stuff that they claim to want. This is extra relevant right now because we've got Donald Trump's harebrained and clueless one-liners about trade deals and bringing back manufacturing jobs and winning against China, China, China. And everyone now is an expert on trade and globalization under Trump. And yet again, we've got a new poll that confirms that Americans love American-made stuff, but they don't want to pay more for American-made stuff. There's a Reuters Ipsos poll which says that 70% of Americans believe it is very important or somewhat important to buy American-made stuff. Okay, that's a good start. The problem is that 37% of Americans would not pay a penny more for US-made products than they pay for foreign-made products. 26% of Americans would be willing to pay 5% more for American-made stuff. And 21% of Americans would be willing to pay up to 10% more. So in total, we have 70% of Americans who want American products and 84% of Americans who are willing to pay at most 10% more. The problem with that is that the premium for buying American is way more than 0, 5, or 10%. For example, Klein Tools Incorporated is an American-made tool company. They've got annual sales of about $500 million. They've got 9-inch pliers, standard 9-inch pliers. They sell for 30% more than a similar set of 9-inch pliers made overseas. Another example, Stanley Furniture, based in North Carolina. They decided to start producing cribs and other baby furniture in the United States back in 2012. They said, we're going to bring this back from China. We'll start producing the cribs and some other baby stuff here in the United States. The imported crib was $400. They brought it back, started producing it domestically, and it retailed for $700. Nobody bought it. They ultimately shut that whole thing down. That U.S. factory was shut down 2 years later in 2014. And this is particularly noticeable right now in the fashion industry, particularly what's called fast fashion. Clothing has been pretty cheap for a while because of manufacturing overseas and sweatshop type production. But now it's at a new level. There's this place called Primark or Primark. I don't know how it's pronounced. There's one in downtown Crossing here in Boston. They're all over the world. You can get pairs of shoes for $2. You can get shirts for $3 at Primark. It's barely more expensive for some of the stuff at H&M. How do you think that it's that cheap for a t-shirt, right? And very interestingly, the lowest income Americans in this study were the most into buying American, even though they are the people least able to afford to pay any more. So this is a really important thing. It's partially important because many of the jobs Trump wants to bring back just don't exist anymore. It's partially important because both Trump and Ivanka Trump produce their own crap and tchotchkes overseas. But it's also really important because Americans won't actually pay more, even if you do bring production back to the United States.
Well, what's more American than a little cognitive dissonance, right? And I think we see the same thing when it comes to the environment. People act as if they are all about buying green, but they don't actually do so until the green alternative is less expensive or at least at the same rate as, maybe something that's not as environmentally friendly.
Yeah, so you see it when it comes to energy expenditures. You don't see most Americans willing to pay any premium to reduce the carbon footprint. You also have one of those situations when it comes to the climate with energy consumption, where everybody's for reducing their carbon footprint sort of in some amorphous, vague, general sense. But when it comes to, okay, we'll downsize your car and start biking to work, all of a sudden it's like, well, I'll let other people do that. I mean, after all, if it's just me who's doing it, it's not going to make any difference.
Also, there's very little incentive for companies to make their products in America when they can do it overseas for so much cheaper. And of course, you see those companies who do proudly say, we make our products in the USA. But that's also about marketing too, because they realize that people will buy their products knowing that it's made in the United States.
Yeah. So even though for a lot of Americans, their ability to pay more is very, very limited, or at least their desire to pay more, there's also a marketing value to made in the USA. And so, the truth is, if a company decides to make in the USA, so to speak, even if they're doing it for optics or PR, it's still not a bad thing, but it is a question of how viable it's going to be in terms of what they need to charge. So whenever you hear these, I call them Trump trade experts. Now everybody knows about NAFTA, everybody knows about free trade and the impacts of all these different things. Whenever you hear them rattling off their one-liners that they barely even understand the meaning of, just remember that almost no one is even willing to pay more for American-made products.